What are the best settings for this monitor? By best settings, I mean the settings I adopted in my review as my test settings, so it kept my colorimeter happy with my usual colorimetric targets I go for, which includes as close to 2.2 gamma as possible and as close to a 6500K white point as possible with a good balanced green channel. Remember that individual units and preferences vary, so these won't be optimal in all cases. The first thing to note is if you want to use VRR on the monitor, or certainly if you want to use adaptive sync, you have to make sure FreeSync Premium Pro is enabled, so it doesn't matter whether you're actually wanting to use FreeSync specifically or whether you're wanting to use G-Sync compatible, or I'd assume HDMI 2.1 VRR on the PS5. The monitor is just branded in this way with AMD FreeSync, but it really is an adaptive sync toggle, and it may also control HDMI 2.1 VRR. And I do like to use VRR even though I have an NVIDIA GPU, so I do have FreeSync Premium Pro enabled in the OSD. The next thing is the picture mode, so the preset of the monitor. I like to use custom, although equally I could have used standard. The only reason I use custom is because I like standard to be kept at the factory defaults just so I can use it as a reference in the review and can easily switch between them. If you like how one of the other settings is set up and you want to use that as a base and tweak from there, then feel free, personal preferences and all that. The monitor doesn't restrict any particular setting, except that with custom you do have access to 6-axis color. So you can change the saturation and hue of the red, green, blue, cyan, magenta and yellow channels. So if you do like to tweak that kind of thing, then stick to the custom setting. For some people though, the best setting would actually be sRGB, and that's an sRGB emulation mode. That does lock off quite a few settings. You can adjust the brightness, but you can't adjust the color channels or the contrast or the gamma setting. As explored in the review, this is a good sRGB emulation setting, or it certainly was on my unit in terms of how it was tuned, and it did provide an accurate sRGB output. So if you want that, you want a more toned down look but accurate within the sRGB color space, which most content is designed around, under SDR at least where this setting is relevant, then you might want to use the sRGB setting, or alternative sRGB emulation. But as usual in my reviews, I do like to use the full native gamut, but I also explore sRGB and any other gamut clamp settings separately. So I'm going to stick to custom. Brightness I set at 60, that gave close to my usual 160 nit target, which is suitable for my lighting environment and my preferences, and importantly it's also consistent with the sort of brightness I would set in other reviews, so I just keep this at that level for consistency. But individual preferences and room lighting does vary. You should always adjust the brightness according to your own preferences. Be aware that any setting I'm not mentioning is left at default for the custom setting, so that includes contrast being left at 50, colour vibrance would be at 10 for example, and gamma left at 2.2. I also set colour temperature to user define, set red to 97, green to 98 and blue to 100. That worked on my unit to get close to 6500K with a good neutral green channel as well. Again, be aware that individual units do vary. If you scroll down a bit further, there's also a colour space setting, which I left at native, because as I said, I want to use the full native gamut, but you can set that to Adobe, which will clamp closer to the Adobe RGB colour space, or Display P3, which will clamp to DCI P3. These settings are explored in the review. So that's how I set things up under SDR. FreeSync Premium Pro enabled. I set picture mode to custom, brightness to 60, and colour temperature set to user define, red 97, green 98, blue 100. Anything not mentioned left at default for the custom setting. I'm going to switch my attention over to HDR now, so I'm just enabling HDR in Windows. I like to use the Windows HDR calibration tool to give an idea of the relative brightness calibration for HDR on monitors with various modes and settings. In-game calibration sliders, they should show similar behaviour, though that can depend on the game and how they've set up the HDR calibration options. Just remember this tool gives an indication of the relative calibration of the screen, not the actual brightness levels you'll experience. So under HDR, your settings are quite different, your presets are different. They'll be called HDR, HDR Game, HDR Movie, HDR Vivid, and HDR Peak 1000. The main HDR setting, as configured by default, that appears to be the Display HDR True Black 400 setting, and that provides a consistent and relatively well-calibrated experience, but with limited peak brightness. There are various settings available in the other HDR modes. You'll see them there. They are greyed out when you use this main HDR setting. The brightness reported in the Windows HDR calibration tool test, it's around 420 nits using this setting. And that is reasonably close to the actual recorded in the review, which was around 480 nits maximum brightness. The HDR Game, HDR Movie and HDR Vivid presets They unlock various additional HDR settings which I was referring to just before, and they set them to different values. They act in much the same way if set to the same values. So really it's just the default setting for these particular things like light enhance, colour enhance, dark enhance, which change between HDR Vivid, HDR Movie and HDR Game. For HDR Peak 1000 the settings can also be changed, but it has its own unique calibration profile, even if you match its settings with one of the other HDR presets. Another relevant setting under HDR when it comes to brightness control and calibration is in OLED Care. So to access that you just press the joystick and then go to the left, go to Settings, APL Stabilize. And that can be configured for all of the HDR settings except HDR Peak 1000 where it's locked off. So if I go back to HDR, the main HDR setting, remember I was on HDR Vivid just before, and APL Stabilize was set to high, but now it's set to middle. That's the default with the HDR setting, although I can change this if I wish. The brightness calibration here in the Windows HDR calibration tool, or if I was using an in-game calibration as well, it doesn't actually change regardless of whether I set APL Stabilize to low, medium or high. But the actual brightness calibration of the monitor and how it's calibrated, that certainly does change if you change APL Stabilize between low, medium and high. In the review I did include some measurements and observations with this set to low and high as well as medium, and this graph I'm showing you at the moment, it's fully analysed in the review, but I'm just quickly bringing it up here for reference. If you set APL Stabilize to low, it's essentially a limited brightness HDR experience. It looks a bit strange in practice, but highly brightness sensitive users could still find that appealing perhaps. Middle is your typical Display HDR True Black 400 style experience that I described earlier. The relatively well calibrated side of that applies with the regular HDR setting which I'm currently using, but various adjustments that are made or that you might like to make manually with other HDR settings can skew that. High provides stronger brightness peaks regardless of the HDR mode you're using. Per the in-game measurements in the review, even with the HDR setting, so the preset simply called HDR on the monitor that I'm currently using, and APL Stabilize at high, it's different to your typical QD OLED HDR Peak 1000 experience. This Gigabyte model avoids dragging down medium shades like your usual HDR Peak 1000 setting where brighter shades dominate, so high APL scenes. It actually tends to over-brighten them instead. This over-brightening is least pronounced, and in some scenes absent, using the main HDR setting, even with APL Stabilize set to high. Again, refer to the review if you want some specific figures for this. The HDR Peak 1000 setting, for example, over-brightens things a bit more heavily. Looking again at the Windows HDR calibration tool, I've now switched over to the HDR Peak 1000 setting. Ideally the brightness reported here would be in line with the actual capability of the display, which is a bit beyond 1000 nits, but it's nowhere near that. It sits closer to an indicated 350 nits, so a bit lower than the 420 nits of the main HDR setting. The contrast is set to 53 in this mode by default. If you lower it to 36, or roughly there, it helps the HDR calibration test go all the way up to about 1100 nits, which is closer to the actual capability of the screen, but it upsets calibration in other respects and the whole image gets a sort of foggy appearance. So it's really best to avoid that and just leave it roughly where it is by default, which is 53 for this HDR mode. Different HDR modes have different settings, and remember the HDR setting, which is grayed out, you can't adjust the contrast anyway. Sometimes this large mismatch between the brightness mapping and actual luminance capability of the screen can be a problem, as you would need to calibrate the monitor in-game or using this tool in a way that will really limit the peak luminance performance, or that will massively crush highlight detail. The way Gigabyte has calibrated this one thankfully avoids that, but if the in-game calibration includes a numerical value for HDR brightness, remember to set this to around 350 nits, or if using the main HDR setting around 420 nits, regardless of the APL Stabilize setting you're using, rather than closer to the actual peak brightness value of around 1000 nits. At least this was all correct on my unit. And if you watch a lot of HDR movie content or play games that don't have an in-game HDR calibration facility, or perhaps a poor one, it's probably worth running through the Windows HDR calibration tool and using the profile it creates for HDR. Remember that HDR-capable games consoles should have their own HDR calibration, so it is worth running through that and making sure that's all set up correctly. So before you fall asleep, let's get into an HDR game and talk about some of the HDR subsettings. So I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is HDR10 content. The monitor supports HDR10. I'll say it will respond to HDR10 content specifically. You can adjust the brightness if you wish, but Gigabyte has calibrated this with this set to 100. So if you're not overly sensitive to brightness, you should probably leave this at 100. If you are, you could reduce this, but remember what I said about APL stabilize? Set that to low or medium, try them out as well. And you'd have to use a different setting to HDR Peak 1000 to use that, so perhaps the main HDR setting, for example. So if you are not too brightness sensitive and you just want sort of a flashy HDR experience, leave this at 100. The contrast, I covered that earlier really, just leave it at the default for whatever setting you're using. Or if you can configure it, it should really be somewhere between 50 to 53. There's a setting called Light Enhance. And what this does is it really just brightens up the image. Even set to 1, it really is crushing highlight detail now. It's super bright there for the medium bright shades. Light Enhance 2 does that further. Light Enhance 3 does that further again. Might not be clear in the video, but things look really funky now. You know, things are very crushed together, these highlight details. But you might like that sort of pop. And maybe in some games it would look more appropriate than it does here, so, you know, you can have a play with that if you want, but it doesn't appeal to me personally, someone who prefers a more accurate HDR reproduction. There's Colour Enhance, and that gives you a saturation boost. It's not a super strong one, so set to 1, it's reasonably subtle, although it is oversaturating various green shades here, and Laura's skin, which you can't really see, and the walls, they're just more saturated and less neutral than they should be, these colours now. 2 pushes it up further. 3 further again, that's the strongest setting. So if you do like this boost in saturation, you like things to look more vivid, perhaps a bit more as they would under SDR using the full native gamut where things are going to be oversaturated for your standard sRGB content. If you like that kind of look, the oversaturation, then this setting may well appeal to you. But again, I prefer things to be more natural, more as intended, which would be this set to 0. There's Dark Enhance, and that's on or off. It's actually on by default with the HDR Peak 1000 setting, but you might have noticed I'd already just turned that off. This gives an uplift to primarily darker shades, but it also affects various medium shades as well. If you like this heavier uplift, then you could have Dark Enhance set to on, or leave it on depending on the setting you're using. But as I explore in the review, the monster gives an uplifted look under HDR anyway, in various scenes. It's already a fairly strong uplift, so if you want an even stronger uplift, then yeah, you can use Dark Enhance, but I prefer to leave it off and you still get a bit of an uplift anyway. So with all that said, just to reiterate, my personal preference is to have everything looking more natural, so no Light Enhance, Dark Enhance or other tweaks here. I don't have a very strong preference between the HDR Peak 1000 setting, which I'm using right now, or HDR, with APL stabilize set to high. But you might have noticed the screen blanked out for a while when I switched between the HDR 1000 setting and this main HDR setting. I also have to get back in the game, so I had to Alt-Tab there quickly. Also have to re-enable HDR in the game. And depending on the HDR setting you've just come from, you might want to recalibrate the HDR in the game as well, the HDR slider, if your game has one. But as I noted earlier, the overbrightening of various medium shades and medium dark shades is a bit stronger using HDR Peak 1000, whilst both settings, so HDR Peak 1000 and HDR with APL stabilize set to high, maintain good bright highlights and peak brightness levels. And again, remember, you could set the APL stabilize to medium or even low if you want to tone down the brightness to give your eyes a bit of a break, or you're simply not in the mood for high brightness. And it's easy to do this if you're using the main HDR setting, so I could easily just set this to middle or low instead. But remember that if you're switching to or from HDR Peak 1000, then you're going to have to be dealing with that signal blanking, and you're going to have to recalibrate things if you want the best experience, and you're going to have to reactivate HDR in the game and perhaps recalibrate the in-game HDR slider when you're using different settings. So it's just a bit more of a faff. So for that reason, my own preference is just sticking to the HDR setting, APL stabilize being set to high most of the time, but if I want to give my eyes a bit of a break, I would just set this to medium for more of an HDR True Black 400 style experience. I'm back on SDR now, and I'm on Lagom.nl, the website in the black levels tests, and I'd like to talk a little bit about visibility enhancement. So the main setting for this is Black Equalizer 2.0, found in gaming. Set to 0 by default, which is no enhancement going on. If you set this to 1, it's quite a bit of an uplift, 2 a stronger uplift, 3 stronger again, but you can go all the way up to 15, and 15 certainly does give a strong uplift. But I've noticed that this setting, going up more than a couple of notches, it does start to blend highlight details a lot as well. So it's not just targeting your darker to medium dark shades, it's actually a bit less selective than that. It might still work for you if you're just really going for absolute visibility and you don't really care about your bright highlight details. That's fine, it'll do the trick for you. But if you want a more balanced approach, which really would just target the darker shades more, which is really the main ones you want for visibility enhancement in those shadowy areas in games, then you could consider the sRGB mode. I can now see all of the blocks quite clearly, including that first block, which is more visible by eye than it will appear in the video. It's not blended in with the background well at all. And that's because, as explored in the review, it's now using sRGB gamma tracking rather than tracking linear 2.2 gamma. So it gives an uplift at the lower end of the gamma curve, so these dark shades are a bit brighter than intended. Like the black equalizer setting, it doesn't make your black any lighter, but it's just more selective for anything a bit brighter than black, but nothing that's too bright. But remember that it's also emulating the sRGB color space, so it will be toning down your saturation and it will lock off various other settings, as I explored earlier. An alternative, go back to custom or whatever preset you prefer to use and set your color space to display P3. That will give you DCI P3 for the gamut, which is closer to the native gamut, so you get a lot of extra saturation still, but it also targets sRGB gamma rather than a linear 2.2 gamma. So that gives you a really nice uplift to these dark details as well. And I'm going to quickly go through the OLED Care menu. I did show you that earlier, but I'm actually going to go through the other options here as well. So remember, press the joystick in, then the left option. It always says OLED Care activating with lots of dots after it, looking like it's loading something and it's going to do something, but it doesn't. It just seems to be the permanent status for some reason. I'm not really sure why. But it does say pixel cleaning ready to start and usage time 150 hours. And that means that my monitor is actually due to do its pixel cleaning cycle. So if I let it go into standby, so a signal to the monitor's lost because Windows has tried to send it to sleep, the screen to sleep, or use the power button to turn the monitor off, but it's still plugged into the wall, then it will just run through its cleaning cycle. So it tries to do this when the monitor's been used cumulatively for, I believe it's every 4 hours, and it takes several minutes to complete. And if you need to interrupt it for any reason, you can do that. You just press the joystick a few times and it will eventually wake up again, and it'll just try and do that pixel cleaning cycle the next time it goes into standby. If you prefer to run it manually, you can do that by using the start cleaning option, and it does say it takes 6 to 8 minutes and the power indicator will flash green during the operation. If the start cleaning feature is grayed out for you, that's because it's not due to actually run its cleaning cycle. Gigabyte has done it that way because it doesn't want people to sort of spam the pixel cleaning cycle at a higher frequency than it's intended, because it could wear out the pixels if you're doing this too often. So my recommendation here is really just to let it do its cleaning cycle when it wants, just when you're naturally not using the monitor. So say you're away for a meal or something like that, or if you're going to bed and you turn the monitor off, it can just do its cycle naturally. And then when you come to use the monitor, it will have long completed its cycle to be ready to use it. There's also a start time delay, so that's how long after you've turned the monitor off before it actually starts running the cycle. So if you don't want it to do it straight away, then don't set that to 0 minutes, have it set to something else. You can have it set all the way up to 120 minutes, 2 hours if you want. Personally, I'm happy for it to just start running the cycle if it feels it needs to, and I'm not using the monitor and the monitor switch off, so to speak. As I mentioned earlier, you can interrupt it, so it's not really a problem in my view. There's static control. Now you might notice that I've actually set a lot of this off, these other settings. That's because I don't like them to interrupt the review, because they can cause different areas of the screen to dim and it can cause inconsistencies during testing. That's why I turn them off, not necessarily because I find them annoying, but my general recommendation is if you do find them annoying, then switch them off. They give you the option. But if you can, just try to have as much of this enabled as you can. Maybe it doesn't annoy you, and that's good because it just gives you a little bit of extra protection from burn-in. But I wouldn't be too paranoid about this personally. Some monitors don't give you all of these options. Anyway, static control, that reduces the screen brightness when the image remains static. So sort of like what some monitors would call a screensaver setting. Depends on the monitor, that means different things on different monitors, but it just dims the screen if nothing's happening for a while. There's pixel shift, and that's the usual kind of algorithm where there's a black border of surplus pixels around the image, which the image will periodically bounce around up, down, left or right. So it'll just shift slightly up, down, left or right within that border. You might have noticed it's just on or off. You can't change how aggressive the pixel shift algorithm is, but I didn't find it annoying personally, so I just left it on. And this particular setting doesn't interrupt the review. APL stabilize, I went through that with reference to HDR. You can also set it in SDR. It's set separately for HDR and SDR. For stability purposes and low ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, I like setting this to low for SDR, which is the default setting. If you don't mind the brightness shifting as the content being displayed changes, generally dimming when brighter content dominates, which is common if you're on the desktop, then you could set this to middle or even high. As covered in the review, the monitor can get impressively bright for a QD OLED under SDR with this set to high. But under SDR, I do prefer it just set to low. Next, there's sub-logo dim, and that can be set to off, low, or high, with high being the most aggressive setting, and low having less of effect, but still more than off, so having some effect in other words. And this reduces the brightness of small static elements such as the taskbar, logos, buttons, that kind of thing, to help prevent image retention. There's a corner dim setting, again on or off, no way of setting how aggressive this is. I personally don't like this kind of setting at all. What it does is it gives a kind of vignetting effect because it can dim the corners of the screen more than the rest of the screen, and it kind of makes it look like the monitor has bad uniformity, which is certainly not what you should expect from an OLED. But if you don't mind the look, then you could have that enabled, but I really do prefer having that disabled. And if you want to reset all of this menu to the factory defaults, you can do that there. And I do like to quickly go through crosshair designs which are included with the monitor. So if you press the joystick in and go to the right rather than the left, so instead of going to the OLED Care menu, you go to Game Assist, and then crosshair, you'll see there are various different styles included on the monitor: simple green crosshair, this design, and that design. You can customize the color and also create your own design for the crosshair using Gigabyte Control Center. I haven't done this recently, but I did do it a while back. I've shown you in some of my older videos. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. It's really beyond the scope of this video. I don't actually use this kind of setting myself, but I just wanted to show you there are on-screen crosshairs, and you can adjust the position and the designs using the Gigabyte Control Center software. You would have to have a USB upstream cable connected to the screen so that it can actually upload your crosshair design onto the monitor. And when I say you can adjust the position, it's always going to be roughly in the center of the screen, but you can just have it slightly offset from the center. Or at least that was the case last time I was designing, and I don't think they've changed that. I think it's roughly in the center of the screen where the crosshair is going to be displayed. So it's a little bit different to what some other monitors let you do.